Now that Shadow of the Erdtree has been out for almost a week, I thought I would make a video ranking the bosses of the DLC. I've spent a pretty good amount of time playing it at this point, and now that I've finished it and I'm a little bit into a second playthrough, I feel like I have a pretty good feeling on each of the bosses within the DLC. So I thought I would just make this video. I really liked the boss roster of this DLC. I think it's probably the best one From has ever had in any of these expansions. And honestly, making this ranking was really hard. I liked pretty much all of these. The bottom two I don't feel as strong about, or really three, but after that, I really like this list. And yeah, let's just get into it. Okay, so coming in at number 11 is going to be Commander Gaius. Bottom of the list here. So this is a boss I have admittedly not spent too much time with. What you're seeing here is just me coming back to get some footage for this boss, because I actually just kind of beat him really quickly on my first playthrough. I took a couple attempts, and the first time I got him past about 60% health, I kind of ended up just fluking this boss. I've done a few attempts past the one you've seen here, and I just can't say I enjoyed this fight a ton. I'm not a super big fan of mounted enemies in the Souls games, or at least in Elden Ring, since that's the one where we've had the most of them. This fight just has a lot of really weird hitboxes. Quite a few things are dodgeable, but the big flurry of attacks that he has can be quite hard to dodge if you start out being really close to him. This is one of those fights that personally I'll probably never get all too good at, but I don't know, maybe some people will find this pretty easy. I didn't find this fight really intuitive to fight on Torrent either. That's why you see me fighting it on foot, because with Torrent it felt really slow and you just had to run away, and even then Gaius can still catch up to you pretty easily. His charge that he starts out with, this video is a bad example, but, well, actually, no, there's some examples in here of the charge just kind of hitting me. It'll sometimes hit twice. It's just a really weird attack that seems to have some weird hitboxes. I think this is the fight that might need the most addressing out of all of them in the DLC as of right now, and is the only one I can say I was close to disliking outright. All the other ones, I've got to say, I actually enjoyed, but I don't know, this one just didn't do it for me, and is just a really odd boss fight. Okay, next up at number 10 is going to be Metir, the Mother of Fingers. So this was one of the last bosses that I managed to find in my first playthrough. I had already maxed out my Erdtree level. I don't know how to pronounce some of these words yet, but I thought this fight was pretty interesting. I don't love the hand enemies. They're not my favorite thing, so I wasn't a huge fan of the design of this boss. I don't think it's bad, don't get me wrong, but it's just, it's a little too gross. But mechanically, I thought the fight was alright. For the most part, it felt pretty fair, although this was just another one of those fights I didn't spend a ton of time with. I think this was maybe my 5th attempt on this one, and the main thing is that her attack, when usually she'll even just do it when you're right in front of her, she'll turn and she'll have this weird walk with the fingers. I have no idea how to dodge it unless you're already far enough away. Like I said, I haven't spent that much time with this boss in particular as well, but that attack in particular could just obliterate my health bar if I got hit from the very start of it. Other than that, I thought a lot of the attacks felt pretty fair, even though I didn't figure out how to dodge some of the stuff involving the black hole thing in phase 2. But overall, this boss was just alright for me. It's one that I am looking forward to fighting again in a second playthrough, though, and seeing what I think of it there. But I can't say too much more than that, since this was just another one where I walked in, took it out, and just kind of admired the visual effects. This gave me a lot of feelings of Abridus in terms of the atmosphere and just overall mood of the fight with how the lighting felt, and just the way the boss looks as well is not too dissimilar to Abridus. Although, this is not the only comparison I'll be making to Abridus in this video, surprisingly enough. But yeah, that's really all I've got for Matir. I think that's how you say that, at least. Alright, coming in at number 9, we've got the Putrescent Knight, or as I like to call him, Orphan of Kos on a horse. I didn't find this fight nearly as hard as Orphan of Kos, at least it didn't take me as long, but I did feel somewhat over-leveled for this fight by the time I got to it. I did explore quite a lot, despite this being only my 4th boss. I think I was level 14 or 15 or so. I pretty much just explored after my 3rd fight, but this boss gave me a decent bit of trouble. The way he swings his, I guess it's a placenta, I'm not entirely sure, honestly. It was really hard to figure out if he was actually swinging sometimes, maybe the timing of some of the swings. It just felt a little odd. Some attacks that I didn't think were surprisingly too bad, though, were a lot of his fire attacks in Phase 2. Once you noticed after a couple tries when he was going to do them, they weren't too bad. And even though it seemed really difficult at first, the horse attack was not too bad. It usually just boiled down to make sure you back up away from him, and then once the horse is on screen, be ready to dodge the horse and dodge away from it, and then just dodge inwards towards him, and you'd usually be able to avoid it. But I did heavily rely on dealing posture damage in this fight to get some staggers, which I did in quite a few of the DLC fights, but this one in particular just gave me a bit of trouble. I really like the visual design of this boss, and finding it after jumping down the giant pit at the bottom of the stone coffin fissure was awesome. There's still quite a lot that I did like here, but I just found this to be a bit of a struggle for me personally, but overall not too bad of a boss, and I still had a lot of fun with it. Coming in at number 8, we have the Divine Beast Dancing Lion. So this is the first boss of the DLC, and this was a way to start the DLC. So I found this boss probably about 2 hours into my first playthrough, and I was a Blessing level 3. And this fight took me probably a good 45 minutes to finally take down. What you're seeing here isn't my first playthrough, this is my second playthrough where I've gotten a stronger Blessing level, and kind of just came in to absolutely demolish him a little bit. But this is a fight that I found pretty tough, and is the only boss in the DLC where I've got to agree with a lot of people that the camera in this fight can kind of suck. It doesn't make it impossible, but it definitely makes it a lot harder than I feel like it should be. I did try to fight this boss unlocked, and I didn't find it too much easier, but maybe it'll just be something I have to get used to with time, but I can't say I was a big fan of the camera in this fight. Other than that, though, this boss is sick. I love the idea of using weather and him changing through 3 different weather phases throughout the battle and changing up his attacks just a little bit, even though most of them remain the same. But stuff like the frost coming out as an AoE during the frost phase and forcing you to time your dodges a little better. Maybe some of the wind being in the background during the wind phase. And then there's just the lightning phase, which feels like utter chaos the moment it begins. It's really tough, and I still haven't really figured this boss out too well yet, but this is definitely a good way to start the DLC. Ever since I saw him in the trailer, I loved how this fight looked. It just looked super cool. The lion is imposing, and I love how you can kind of notice the people piloting him in the back if you pay attention to his legs as he moves around. But overall, great boss fight, and I loved it. Coming in at number 7, we have Scorpioness Najka from Dark Souls 2. Wait, no, sorry, wrong game. We have Romina, Saint of the Bud. This boss was really, really cool. I can't believe that From made a boss revolving around so much pink and all the flowers during it, but it kind of just made it absolutely terrifying. I really, really liked it. This was another one of those fights that I probably did a little later than I should have, and ended up just beating it fairly quickly. But I just loved most of the visual effects in this fight. The butterflies being all over the place when going into the transition into phase 2, the explosion they have, while still being scary, is very much dodgeable. And then the Scarlet Rot absolutely terrified me when I first saw it. And to top it off, this boss came at the end of my personal favorite area of the DLC. The Ruins of Ra, I think it was, were such a visual treat, and I couldn't even believe I was looking at a From Software game when playing it. But this boss fit really well with the area. It coming off as a bit of a weird, almost unnatural creature. I don't know the lore of these bosses yet, but this one I feel like is going to be pretty interesting. I loved a lot of the scorpion tail attacks that this boss had as well. It kind of made it a little harder to read and figure out the boss at first, but I thought these attacks added a lot to the fight instead of it just being her attacking with the melee weapon that she had. And the way she moved around was also just really elegant half the time, despite being a scorpion. And I thought it made the fight really, really interesting. Overall, great boss fight, and was definitely a really solid one to be one of the 3 required bosses to finish the DLC. Okay, coming in at number 6 is none other than the final boss of this DLC, Promised Consort Radahn and Radahn, Consort of Miquella. This boss is one that I think is going to be very difficult to talk about. There is a lot I really liked about this fight. Phase 1 was absolutely wild, but before even talking about that, the entrance for this fight was really sick. I was a little disappointed at first when it was just Radahn after all that buildup, but just how they had him standing there from afar and you're just kind of wondering who it is as you see just the shadow until you finally notice who it is. And then you just have that oh shit moment, realizing that you're not about to fight the weakened Radahn we fought in the base game. And boy does he live up to that. This is the hardest boss in any of these games. I was beating my head against the wall on this fight for hours and hours, and I could not get anywhere with the second phase. Phase 1 in particular, though, I think is actually really fair, aside from the 1-2 cross combo. That combo in particular, just, it's a really, really narrow timing and feels a little inconsistent. Maybe it's just one of those things that we haven't figured out too well yet because the DLC's only been out for a week, but that one definitely gave me a lot of trouble. But then, after all that, you get him to about 60% health, and then Miquella comes along, and phase 2 begins. Yeah, this phase is wild, and that is the main reason that this boss is at this point in the list. I do think a lot of the mechanics here are pretty good, honestly. It's really hard, but most of these attacks are eventually dodgeable. When it comes to the phantom ones, I don't know how to dodge them personally, but now that I've watched some videos of other people fighting them, such as Ongball, I can see different ways you can dodge them, but it's definitely some that'll take me quite a while to figure out. But I do think the main issue with this phase is just how hard it is to see. The main reason I ended up being stuck for so long was because for probably around 4 hours of my 5.5 hours of attempts, maybe even more than that, I was consistently getting to the start of phase 2. I would get him down to maybe 50%, maybe about 45% health, and just get absolutely obliterated instantly. I could not even figure out what I was supposed to be trying to do when it came to this boss fight. Eventually, I tried stacking holy damage negation and physical damage negation, and this really helped out. I finally got him down about 30 minutes after I figured out to do this. It's definitely still really hard, but it made the fight more manageable. The main reason being that since I could survive a lot more hits, I was finally able to learn what was actually going on in Phase 2, and realized that most of the melee combos are basically the same as Phase 1, they just have the added light pillars. But the light pillars do obstruct your view quite a lot, and Miquella's hair can also get in the way quite a lot. And those are the main things that bring this fight down for me. But I really appreciate how challenging this fight really was. This maybe should have been optional, but considering this is a DLC, and the DLCs are always harder anyways, I can respect FromSoft's decision to put such a difficult super boss as the final boss of the DLC as a bit of an ultimate challenge for anyone who plays the DLC and is willing to rise up and take it on. And there's already been tons of different ways people are figuring out how to absolutely obliterate this boss if you want to take one of those options, or you can just no-hit it without parries or anything really if you want to. I think this is going to be a fight that takes us a while to actually figure out, so I don't want to be too hasty to ask for it to be nerfed quite yet, but only time will tell how things will occur with this boss. But I did like quite a lot about it, and that's why I've put it so high up on this list. Okay, coming in at number 5 is one I was not expecting to put this high when I originally started to put my list together. This was a bit of a surprising hit for me. I really liked the Erdtree avatar. I thought this fight was just quite fun. It was super hidden, and I could not believe I found it, honestly, just stumbling upon it on my own. I think this was the 5th boss of the DLC that I managed to take down, if I remember right. I remember doing it before Mesmer, but I did find it after him. But this boss was just... I love the visual design of this boss. It's so creepy. It feels so Bloodborne, and this is where I'm going to bring up the Abridus similarities again. In quite a few ways, I think it's mainly the head for me, just like how it hangs down. It feels really similar to Abridus and Amygdala from Bloodborne, but the way it felt to fight this boss I thought was a lot more manageable than stuff like that. A lot of his attacks were really dodgeable up close. My fight is not a good example to go off of, probably, as this was just another one of those bosses that I probably fought a bit over leveled. And I think this one took me around 7 attempts to defeat, although the first attempt really threw me in for a loop when I just came in, I killed him, and I was like, well, that was easy. And then the second one just popped out, and I was like, oh, okay, this keeps going. And at first I was going around the arena looking for something to break, like it was the Seath fight, thinking that maybe he would just infinitely respawn, until I realized you just have to take out a couple of them for the fight to really end. But I like how he gradually gets an extra move or two with each one that you fight, and most of these attacks felt pretty alright to dodge. The explosion in the 3rd phase was one that I never quite figured out, but I'm sure if I just ran away from it, it would have been fine. But why do that when I can just tank it? I'm kidding, but this fight was really fun, and is just a visual treat finding it all the way down here. Really stellar fight, and one that I'm surprised that I ended up putting so high on this list, honestly. Okay, now we're starting to get into the big boys of this DLC. Coming at number 4, we have Rellana, the Twin Moon Knight. This was my first major wall of the DLC. I found this boss at about Blessing level 5 on my first playthrough. The clip you're seeing, I'm at Blessing level 9. And this is probably a little high for this boss, but definitely makes it a lot more manageable, especially after the patch that rolled out this morning as of me recording this that changed the first 10 blessing levels. I think this will make this fight in particular a lot more manageable for people finding it around level 5 or so, because doing it launch day at level 5, I got pretty frustrated and stuck on this boss. When I first saw phase 2, I was instantly in love with it. The visual flair is incredible, and seeing Pontiff Sullivan, but basically way harder and just intense, was awesome. Which Pontiff Sullivan was already a really intense fight, but for a little bit there I was getting really frustrated with this boss using my Milady build and just could not find the openings. The combos felt endless, and this was definitely one of the biggest walls of the DLC for me. But upon doing my second run, it felt like I was seeing more openings. It was very helpful that I had beaten the DLC at this point and gone toe-to-toe with bosses like Radahn, to where this just felt like nothing compared to that by at this point. But this is definitely going to be the DLC's first major skill check for a lot of people. This boss will demand a ton from you and is just going to be quite difficult for a lot of people, myself included. But I would be lying if I said I didn't find this fight incredibly fun, just adrenaline pumping, and great the whole way through. When I finally beat it, I felt so satisfied to see her finally go down, and it was just such a fun time all around. This fight absolutely deserves to be high up on this list, and I hope that we get more fights like this in the future, because this one was certainly a treat. Okay, coming in at number 3 is going to be Midra, the Lord of Frenzied Flame. This was not a boss I was expecting to find after playing some Metal Gear Solid and basically begging to be thrown back onto that bridge in Murgo's loft with those winter lanterns, because getting here was definitely a long journey, and to find this boss at the end ready to kick my butt even harder was certainly something. But I loved this boss fight. This was definitely a surprising find in this DLC. This was definitely one of those fights where, like, at first I was really struggling with this one. I still did, even all the way to my last attempt, and it's one I'm going to have to spend a lot more time learning. But I can see all of his attacks are really fair, they're really well telegraphed. You can dodge them all really consistently. It's just one of those things that will take me some time to get good at. But the one attack I did not quite figure out really is the transition into phase 2 when he jumps up and then he comes back down. That one I never did figure out how to dodge or if I could even run away from it. So in the fight you can just kind of see me tanking it directly, but I was really thrilled to get a fight with some sort of frenzied flame enemy. It was just nice getting some sort of fight that revolved around madness a lot. One of the things that did go a long way for me in this fight, though, was that not every one of his attacks built up the madness. He really had to get hit by the flames themselves. It wasn't really his melee weapon that did that. And that was one of the things that I think made this fight so good and so fair in particular. But this is definitely one of those fights where I found it super duper late. I was trying to figure out how to find this map fragment where this was for so long, but I kind of ended up finding the catacombs to get down here. I got the grace and then I left because I didn't feel like doing a catacombs, and then once I was told by one of my friends that this is how you got the last map fragment, I came down here pretty close to the end of my playthrough. This was I guess the 8th boss I fought. I did this one and Matir pretty much back to back, and one of my friends told me they thought this is a lot easier than Matir. I found it to be the opposite. This was definitely one of the harder bosses in the DLC for me. It took me around an hour and a half to kill him, but I actually loved just about every moment of it. Learning his moveset is an absolute treat, and I think this is going to be one of those fights that people look on really fondly from this DLC. Stellar boss fight all around, truly. Okay, time for number 2. And I just want to say that number 2 and number 1 are basically equal. I think these are some of the best boss fights that FromSoft has ever created. And honestly, I was gonna put this at number 1 originally. The only thing that keeps Veil the Dread from being number 1 definitively for me is the camera in this fight. It does struggle a little with dragons, but I don't think this is too bad. It's about the same as Midir when it comes to the camera. And speaking of Midir, I've always liked Calamite, Sign, and Midir about equally. I've always loved all 3 of those dragon fights. Veil clears those, and if you ask me, this fight was incredible. I found this one as the 3rd boss of the DLC, and it was the 3rd one I managed to defeat because I was stubborn with this one. This was the one boss of the DLC where I did not leave and come back at a really high level. I found him around level 10. I think I beat him at level 12, and it took me over 4 hours to kill this boss. I loved every single second of fighting him. This dragon's moveset was really fair. I never felt it was complete BS, aside from maybe the regular flamethrower attack sometimes, or I guess it's a lightning breath, but not the one that sweeps, the one that's pretty much straightforward. Sometimes that would hit me a little weird. Other than that, I thought this fight you could get really consistent with if you spent enough time with it. But the one thing I need to talk about with this boss is just how perfect I thought the build-up to it was. This was definitely, when I found it, I thought, okay, so this is the super secret super boss that FromSoft has put in here. Not really expecting Radahn, but coming through the dragon pit and defeating the ancient dragon man, and coming out to find the jagged peak, at first I was like, okay, so we've got a lot of dragons, you find Aigon, and you keep going, and eventually you start to wonder what's going on. There's pretty much nothing in Jagged Peak other than a couple dragons. And normally I would kind of wonder where some of the enemies or some of the items are, but not this time. The storm happening in the background as you ride up the peak and you start seeing all the dragon corpses as you're climbing up really set the tone for this fight. I thought it was absolutely perfect. And you're just sitting there wondering what on earth could be at the top of this thing to where all these corpses are lying around. And when you find Veil up there, that dread, it really sets in. He lives up to it. This boss is tough. It was probably the second hardest one of the DLC, if you ask me. But I thought it was really good. I thought it was really fair. And it just got better as the fight went on. That transition into phase 2 with the explosion, his wings coming out are crazy. People love the Aigon quest. I had to watch it because personally, I wanted to beat all these bosses without summons. That's how I chose to play this. But I respect the quest line, honestly. It's really cool, and Aigon's lines are delivered really well. And I think it does add a lot to this boss fight. I could gush about this fight all day, it feels like. It is so good. Down to the fact that, like, if you start looking at him, you can see Veil's actually missing a leg. One of their wings is broken, and yet you are still just getting demolished by this boss. But this boss was really fun. I honestly wonder what the average level is going to be for this boss, or what even the recommended one is going to be. I've seen people saying they fought this boss at level 18 and were getting their butts kicked. I was getting my butt kicked too, but I felt pretty fine around level 12. That's when I chose to fight this. But this is just, wow. I could not believe that this fight was in this DLC, because it was just incredible and easily up there as one of my favorite bosses from the entire Soulsborne series. Okay, coming in at number 1 is pretty obvious at this point by process of elimination. It's Mesmer the Impaler. This was a boss coming into the DLC. I was like, alright, when are we going to fight Mesmer, and how hard is he going to be? Is he going to be like the Melania of the DLC? What's this fight going to be like? Is it going to feel completely insane? The answer is it is completely insane. This fight is awesome. There's a reason it's at number 1. Mesmer is imposing, he's terrifying, his fight is intense, it is fast, but he has a lot of openings. I thought his fight was really fair. I got really consistent at it. If there's any boss in this DLC that I think I could sit down and take the time to learn how to no-hit, I think this is the one. This is very much this DLC's Artorias. He's not necessarily the hardest boss in it, and he's not the final boss, but I do think he's the best boss in this DLC. I think there's a reason From chose to make this the poster child of the DLC, and I can see why after fighting him, because this fight was just so much fun. I think it took me around 2 or 2.5 hours to finally beat this guy. Phase 1 was really fun to learn. I was really worried that his twirl, jump up, 4 or 5 hit thrust combo and then come down with the explosion was going to be like a waterfowl situation at first. I very quickly learned it was not. This attack was much easier to figure out than the waterfowl, if you ask me. And then phase 2, the fight just gets even more intense with all the snake attacks. I can see some complaints about maybe the attack where he brings like 4 or 5 snakes out and does a barrage. That one felt pretty tough to dodge. I only saw it a couple times, but it seemed kind of similar to Melania's phantom attack, and I thought this was a little easier to dodge than that phantom attack in particular, but it's one I'd have to see a couple times. But I did manage to dodge it at the very least. From always saves their best bosses for the DLC, it seems like, and honestly these top like 4 bosses were some of the best fights in Elden Ring. There's a reason that this boss is number 1. There's a reason Bale is basically tied for it. And there's a reason I loved Rellana and Midra so much. And it's because all of these fights were super stellar. I loved them all. And holy crap, was this DLC good. I had a wonderful time playing through this. There's a reason I've already started my second run. I will be playing this more throughout the year and the years to come, because honestly, I liked this even more than the base game. I thought the map was extremely well designed. The challenge was pretty high, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it was too hard. I thought it gradually increased pretty well from the start. It started out pretty difficult, a little bit easier than even like Moog at the start if you ask me, but by the end, with the exception of the massive difficulty spike of Radahn, I thought the difficulty was a really good level and about what I expected from Software's DLC, if you ask me. I didn't think that this was too overly hard in comparison to their older DLCs, and I honestly had an easier time with this than my first playthrough of Sekiro. The difficulty of this is going to vary for a lot of people, I'm sure, but overall, Shadow of the Erdtree was an absolutely amazing expansion, probably my favorite piece of Souls content to ever release, and by extension my favorite DLC of all time. I had such a wonderful time playing this and figured I would just throw some thoughts in at the end here, since this is probably going to be the last Shadow of the Erdtree video I'm going to put up for quite a while until I make a Let's Play or something of Elden Ring. And other than my Gaius fight, once I eventually do a second Gaius fight, I'll upload one of those. But I hope you all enjoyed watching this boss ranking video. I had so much fun making it and fighting all these bosses, and I will see you all later. Bye-bye.